The porcelain felt impossibly fragile in Amani's hands. A fine, almost translucent white, painted with a single, delicate plum blossom. It was cold, a stark contrast to the heat coiling in her stomach. She stared down at the oolong tea, its amber surface placid, a perfect mirror of the ceiling above, refusing to look at the man sitting opposite her. Kwon Ji-hoon's father, a man whose stillness was more intimidating than any overt threat. His eyes, so like his son's, were analytical, stripping away her composure layer by layer. Beside him, Ji-hoon's mother smiled, a precise, practiced expression that didn't reach her eyes. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on Amani's shoulders. She had worn the green dress for a business dinner. That's what he had said. A potential investor, a crucial meeting, a favor he was cashing in after 3 years of absolute, soul-crushing silence. He had sounded just the same on the phone, calm, deliberate, a voice that gave nothing away. She had resisted, her pride a raw, jagged thing. But he had been persuasive in his understated way, mentioning a connection that could help with the gallery she was trying to open, a subtle pressure point he knew just how to apply. So she had agreed, steeling herself for an evening of professional pleasantries, a transactional encounter she could survive. She had not, under any circumstances, agreed to this. To be sitting in the heart of the Kwon family home, a place that felt more like a fortress, under the searing scrutiny of his parents, while Ji-hoon's words echoed in the profound quiet. "This is Amani, my girlfriend." He had said it so simply, with the same flat intonation he might use to order a coffee. No warning, no discussion. He had simply walked her into the lion's den and declared her his own. The lie was a physical weight, a stone in her throat. Every beat of her heart was a hammer of fury against her ribs. She could feel his presence beside her, a solid wall of controlled energy. He hadn't touched her, not even a guiding hand on her back as they entered, but she felt his proximity like a brand. Why? The question screamed in her mind, a frantic, desperate wail. After leaving her so broken, after disappearing from her life so completely that she had to rebuild herself from the dust. Why this? Why now? This wasn't a rekindling. It was an act of possession. A strategic move in a game she didn't know she was playing. She risked a glance at him. His face was a mask of placid respect, his posture deferential to his father, but his hands, resting on his knee, were perfectly still. Too still. She knew that stillness. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane, the absolute control he exerted over the chaos he wielded so effortlessly. And she was the chaos now, a pawn he had just placed on the board. The fragile teacup trembled in her grasp, and she set it down on the polished wood table with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Ji-hoon registered the click of the teacup. He had been waiting for it, a sign of the tremor beneath her magnificent composure. He had watched her from the moment he'd picked her up, taking in the way she held herself, the proud line of her shoulders in the elegant green dress that clung to her form. She was more beautiful than he remembered, but that wasn't what struck him. It was the strength. It was in the cool, measured way she'd greeted him, in the guardedness of her eyes, a shield she had forged in his absence. He had built the fire, and she had turned it into armor. The thought brought a strange, bitter satisfaction. He needed that strength now. He needed her armor. His father's gaze shifted from Amani to him, a silent, weighty inquiry. Ji-hoon met it without flinching. This was a necessary lie, a preemptive strike. For weeks the pressure had been mounting, whispers of a strategic alliance, a marriage to the daughter of the Choi family, a union that would consolidate power but chain him to a life he refused to lead. He needed a reason to refuse, a reason so solid, so irrefutable, that even his father, a man who viewed emotion as a liability would have to concede. He needed someone utterly disconnected from his world, someone they couldn't control, someone who would be seen as an unacceptable but immovable fact. He needed Imani. The cruelty of it was not lost on him. He was using the very memory of their shared past, a past he had unilaterally detonated, as a tool for his present convenience. He knew, with absolute certainty, the rage that must be churning inside her. He could almost feel it radiating from her, a palpable heat in the cold, formal room. His mother, ever the diplomat, finally broke the silence. "She is very lovely, Ji-hoon." Her voice was smooth as silk, but the words were a careful probe. Ji-hoon simply inclined his head. Yes. One word, a confirmation, not an elaboration. He would give them nothing more. His internal world was a different matter. It was a landscape of cold calculation, but a single, stubborn weed was pushing through the concrete. The image of Imani's face when he'd said the words. The brief, unguarded flicker of shock and betrayal before the mask slammed down. He had anticipated her anger, but he had not anticipated the sharp, visceral pang in his own chest at having caused it. It was an unfamiliar, unwelcome sensation. He had spent the last 3 years excising her from his life, telling himself it was for her own good, a necessary amputation to keep her safe from the poison that ran through his veins. And now he had dragged her right back into the very heart of it, not for her safety, but for his own selfish needs. He was a hypocrite. He knew it. The words sat cold and heavy in his gut. He watched her lift her chin, her gaze finally rising from the table to meet his father's. There was no fear in her eyes. There was fire. And in that moment, he knew he had chosen correctly. She would not break. The drive back to her apartment was a master class in weaponized silence. The plush leather interior of the black sedan seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only the low hum of the engine and the frantic pounding of Imani's own heart. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, a pressure building between them that felt volatile enough to shatter the bulletproof glass. Ji-hoon drove with an unnerving calm, his focus on the rain-slicked Seoul streets, his profile a study in stoic indifference. It was the same indifference that had gutted her 3 years ago, the same impenetrable wall she had thrown herself against until she was bruised and broken. She had sworn she would never be in this position again, vulnerable to his silence, a victim of his emotional voids. And yet, here she was. She stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of neon color, a reflection of the chaos inside her. The rage from the dinner had cooled into something harder, something icier and more lethal. She was meticulously cataloging every detail of the evening, the way his mother's eyes had assessed her from head to toe, the way his father had asked a deceptively simple question about her family, a test she hadn't known she was taking. And through it all, Ji-hoon had sat there, a placid statue, letting her fend for herself in a den of wolves. He had used her as a shield, a statement, a defiance against his family. The car slowed, pulling to a smooth stop in front of her building. For a moment, neither of them moved. The engine idled, a soft, rhythmic purr. This was it, the moment of confrontation. He finally turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable in the dim light of the dashboard. "Imani," he began, his voice low. "Don't," she cut him off, her own voice sharp, brittle. "Don't you dare say my name like you have any right to it." She unbuckled her seatbelt with a sharp click and pushed the door open, not waiting for him. But he was faster. By the time she was on the pavement, the cold night air a shock against her skin, he was standing in front of her, blocking her path to the door. "What was that, Ji-hoon?" she demanded, her voice a low, furious tremor. "What in God's name was that?" He just looked at her, his expression unchanged. A dinner? A dinner? You parade me in front of your parents and announce that I'm your girlfriend? A lie, a complete and utter fabrication, and you call it a dinner? Her voice rose with every word, the control she had maintained for hours finally fracturing. After 3 years of nothing, not a word, not a single goddamn word. You don't get to do that. You don't get to just reappear and throw my life into chaos for your own amusement. He remained silent, his stillness a stark contrast to her trembling rage. He was just watching her, absorbing her fury as if it were nothing more than a passing storm. The arrogance of it, the sheer audacity, stole her breath. "Answer me," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, leaving a raw, aching vulnerability. "Why?" He took every word like a physical blow, letting her anger wash over him without defense. He deserved it. He knew that. Every sharp, wounded accusation was a truth he couldn't deny. He watched the fire in her eyes, the tremor in her hands that she tried to hide by clenching them into fists at her sides. He had done this. He had broken her calm, shattered the peace she had so painstakingly built in the rubble he'd left behind. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant sounds of the city and her ragged breathing. An apology would be an insult. Words of regret were hollow, meaningless currency against a debt this large. He had made a choice 3 years ago to cut her out, a decision he'd framed as a necessity. He had told himself it was to protect her. Tonight, he had proven that to be a lie. He had brought the danger directly to her doorstep because he was cornered, and in his desperation, he had reached for the only person who had ever represented something real in his life, of carefully constructed artifice. He was a selfish man. It was the one truth he had always known about himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of the emotion churning beneath the surface. "I need you." The words were stark, stripped of all pretense. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't an apology. It was a confession of his motive. Imani stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "You need me?" she repeated, the words laced with bitter irony. "You need me? For what? A prop? A convenient lie to solve whatever family drama you've gotten yourself into?" "Yes," he said. The honesty was brutal, deliberate. He would not lie to her now. "Not about this. My father is arranging a marriage, an alliance. I will not do it." He saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes, quickly followed by a fresh wave of anger. She understood the stakes of his world, at least in the abstract. She knew what such an alliance would mean. "So this is your solution?" she spat. "To drag me into it? To put a target on my back? Do you have any idea what you've just done, Ji-hoon? The kind of people you've just exposed me to?" "I know," he said, the 2 words he always used. An acknowledgement, not an argument. It was his shield, his way of ending a conversation by absorbing the final point. But this time, it wasn't enough. He took a step closer, violating the space she had drawn around herself. "It's a deal, Imani, a transaction. I need you to play this part for 2 months, just until the Choi deal is off the table. After that, I walk away. You never have to see me again." He paused, letting the cold, transactional nature of the offer sink in. "And in return," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "the funding for your gallery. All of it. No strings. And protection. My protection. No one will touch you." He was offering to buy her, to pay for the wound he was inflicting. It was a language he understood. Power, money, security. It was the only thing he knew how to give. Imani felt the air leave her lungs, as if he had physically struck her. A deal. A transaction. He stood before her, offering to pay for her complicity, to reduce whatever had once existed between them to a line item on a ledger. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. He thought he could wound her and then offer a bandage made of money. He thought her pride, her safety, her very identity had a price tag. and he was powerful enough to meet it. Her first instinct was a violent, visceral no. She wanted to laugh in his face, to tell him to take his blood money and his protection and choke on them. She had survived without him for 3 years. She had scraped together her own funding, built her own connections, carved out a life that was hers, untainted by the darkness that clung to him like a second skin. She didn't need him. She didn't. But as the initial wave of fury receded, a colder, more pragmatic reality began to seep in. The gallery. It was her dream, the culmination of everything she had worked for, and it was failing. The primary investor had pulled out last week, leaving her with a signed lease, a roster of hopeful artists, and a mountain of debt that was threatening to crush her. He knew. Of course he knew. He wouldn't have made the offer if he hadn't known exactly where to press, exactly how deep the financial wound was. He had done his research. The thought made her feel sick, violated. He hadn't just appeared out of the blue. He had been watching. And the protection. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air traced its way down her spine. Last month, there had been a break-in at her small studio. Nothing of significant value was taken, just some sketches and mock-ups for the gallery. The police had dismissed it as random vandalism, but it had left her with a lingering sense of unease, a feeling of being watched. Had that been a warning? A message from his world spilling into hers? A sudden, terrifying memory surfaced. A different night, years ago. They were walking by the Han River, the city lights glittering on the water. It was one of the rare moments he had let his guard down. He'd been talking about his family, the weight of his name, the future that was a gilded cage. He had taken her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, and told her, "You're the only real thing in my life, Imani." He had looked at her with an intensity that felt like a vow. The memory was so vivid, so filled with a lost, painful tenderness, that it made the present moment feel even colder, even more transactional. That man, the one who saw her as real, was gone. In his place stood this stranger, a pragmatist offering a contract. One part of her screamed to run, to protect what was left of her heart, but another, quieter part, the part that was a survivor, recognized the brutal logic of his offer. It was a lifeline. A poisoned one, but a lifeline nonetheless. She looked at his impassive face, the man who was both her deepest wound and her most pragmatic solution. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Fine. The single word hung in the air between them, a binding contract forged of desperation and fury. Fine. Ji-hoon's expression didn't change, but Imani thought she saw a flicker of something in the depths of his eyes. Not relief, but a grim, somber acknowledgement. He had won. He had laid out the terms, identified her weakness, and pressed until she yielded. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "My driver will pick you up tomorrow at 7. We have a charity gala." Just like that, they moved from the raw confrontation on the street to the practicalities of their charade. There was no room for her emotional fallout, no space for the hurricane of feelings tearing through her. He had a problem, and she was now officially the solution. She wanted to scream. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against the cold that was seeping into her bones. "I have nothing to wear to a gala," she said, the words flat and lifeless. It was a stupid, practical objection, but it was the only weapon she had left. He didn't miss a beat. "That's been taken care of. A delivery will arrive in the morning." Of course it had. He left nothing to chance. She was not a partner in this deception. She was an asset he was managing, a role he was costuming. The thought was deeply, profoundly humiliating. She finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly, letting him see the full extent of the cold fury in her eyes. "Let's get one thing clear, Ji-hoon. I will do this. I will play the part. But that is all it is, a part. You will not touch me. You will not show up unannounced. You will treat this as the business arrangement it is. Do you understand?" For the first time, a shadow of something unreadable crossed his face. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching until it was thin and taut. He seemed to be searching for something in her face, something he'd lost. "I understand," he said, his voice a low murmur. He stepped back, finally giving her space, the physical distance a concession to the boundaries she had just drawn. He turned and walked back to the car without another word, the door closing with a solid, definitive thud. Imani stood on the pavement, watching the black sedan disappear into the city's endless river of light, until its taillights were just two fading red stars. She didn't move. She couldn't. The deal was done. She had sold a piece of herself to save her dream, and she already felt the ghost of his ownership settling over her. She was a bird in a gilded cage he was building around her, and the most terrifying part was that she had just willingly handed him the key. The dress was a weapon. It arrived the next morning in a box so large it barely fit through her doorway, a silent, opulent invasion of her space. It was deep crimson silk, a color of passion and danger, cut with a severe architectural elegance that was both modest and devastatingly sensual. It clung to her body as if it were spun just for her. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger, a beautiful, formidable woman who looked like she belonged in Kwon Ji-hoon's world. She hated it. She hated him for knowing, even after all this time, exactly what would suit her. It was an intimacy he had no right to possess. The evening was a blur of gilded surfaces and hollow laughter. The charity gala was held in a massive, glittering ballroom filled with the city's elite. Ji-hoon was a magnetic presence at her side, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. It was a proprietary, possessive gesture, yet his touch was impersonal, a cool weight against the silk of her dress. It was for the audience. He was playing his part. She watched him navigate the crowd, his quiet authority parting people before him. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. He introduced her with the same simple, declarative statement as before. "This is Imani." He said it with a quiet pride that felt so real, so convincing, it made her skin crawl. She smiled, she nodded, she accepted compliments on her dress with a practiced grace she didn't know she had. But inside she was screaming. Every polite smile felt like a betrayal of the rage she harbored. Every moment she spent by his side felt like a step back into the past she had fought so hard to escape. They were seated at a table with a few of his business associates, men with hard eyes and wives with brittle smiles. The conversation was a dance of veiled threats and strategic compliments. It was a language of power, and Ji-hoon was fluent. Imani remained silent, an elegant, exotic accessory. At one point, under the cover of the table, his thumb brushed against her hand. It was the briefest of touches, a fleeting spark of warmth, but it shot through her like an electric current. Her breath hitched. She pulled her hand away as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. She risked a glance at him. He was listening intently to the man beside him, his expression unchanged, giving no indication he had even noticed. But she knew he had. It wasn't part of the act. It was a test. A small, subtle push against the boundaries she had set. And the worst part, the devastating, terrifying truth, was that for a split second, she hadn't wanted to pull away. He felt her flinch. He felt the sharp, sudden withdrawal of her hand, the way her entire body stiffened beside him. He had known it was a mistake the moment his thumb moved, an unconscious gesture, a ghost of an old habit from a time when touching her was as natural as breathing. He kept his face a mask of cool indifference, continuing his conversation with Mr. Park about shipping routes, but his mind was elsewhere. It was on the faint scent of her perfume, a subtle mix of jasmine and something warmer, something that was uniquely her. It was on the memory of that scent on his pillows, in his apartment, a ghost he had never successfully exorcised. He hated this. He hated the necessity of this charade, the inherent violation of dragging her into this gilded cage. But as he looked around the room, at the circling sharks in their bespoke suits, he knew he'd had no other choice. He saw Choi Jin-woo across the room, the man his father wanted him to call brother-in-law, watching them with a predatory stillness. Choi's gaze lingered on Imani, a cold, speculative assessment that made Ji-hoon's hands clench into fists beneath the table. This was why he needed her. Imani was his declaration of war, a beautiful, unexpected, and utterly non-negotiable refusal. Later, as the evening wound down, a slow song began to play. It was a soft, melancholic melody he recognized. It was the song that had been playing in a small, crowded jazz bar in Itaewon the first time he had kissed her. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, a flashback, sharp and vivid. Her, laughing, her head thrown back, the low lights of the bar catching the joy in her eyes. Him, leaning in, his heart pounding with a feeling so intense it terrified him. He remembered the taste of her lips, the surprised, soft sound she made before she kissed him back. It was a memory of a different man, a man who hadn't yet been consumed by the shadows of his name, a man who had been capable of a simple, uncalculated happiness. The memory was so potent it left him breathless. He looked at Imani. She was staring at her hands, her expression closed off, but he saw the slight tremor in her fingers. She remembered too. The song, this moment, it was a shared piece of their history, a ghost rising between them at the table. On a reckless impulse, driven by the ghost of the man he used to be, he stood up and held out his hand. "Dance with me," he said, his voice low, not a request but a quiet command. It was a breach of their contract, a move that went far beyond the public performance. It was personal. It was a risk. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the war between her pride and the pull of the melody. He waited, his hand outstretched, the entire ballroom fading away until there was only her. Imani stared at his outstretched hand. It was a familiar hand, long-fingered and strong, a hand that had once traced the line of her spine, held her face as he kissed her, tangled in her hair. Now it was offered to her as part of a performance, a public display of ownership. But the song was not part of the act. It was theirs, a fragile, secret thing from a lifetime ago. To dance with him to this song would be to acknowledge that shared past, to give it breath in the cold, sterile present. Her mind screamed no. It was a trap, another way for him to pull her back in, to blur the lines she had fought so hard to draw. But her body, traitorously, remembered. It remembered the feeling of being in his arms, the way they moved together as if they were two parts of a whole. The memory was a physical ache, a deep, resonant longing that defied logic and reason. Slowly, as if in a trance, she placed her hand in his. His skin was warm, his grip firm and sure, as he led her to the dance floor. The crowd parted for them, their whispers a low hum in the background. He pulled her close, his hand settling once more on the small of her back, his other hand enveloping hers. The distance between them vanished. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest, the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against hers. She kept her eyes fixed on the knot of his tie, refusing to look at his face. If she looked at him, she would fall apart. They moved together in silence, their bodies swaying to the sad, sweet melody. The steps were effortless, a muscle memory her body had not forgotten. For a few stolen moments, the pretense fell away. There were no contracts, no lies, no painful history. There was only the music, and the man holding her, and the ghost of what they had been. He smelled the same, a faint, clean scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him. It was a scent that had once meant safety and passion and home. Now it was just another form of torture. He dipped his head, his breath warm against her temple. "You're trembling," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that traveled through her. "I'm cold," she lied, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," he said, and in those 2 words she heard everything he wasn't saying. "I know this is hard. I know I'm asking the impossible. I know I hurt you." He tightened his hold ever so slightly, a gesture that felt less like possession and more like support, a silent, fleeting acknowledgement of her pain. When the song ended, he didn't immediately let go. They stood there for a heartbeat, frozen in the middle of the dance floor, the world holding its breath around them. Then he released her, and the cage slammed shut once more. But something had shifted. A tiny hairline crack had appeared in the wall between them, and a fragile, dangerous light was beginning to shine through. The ride home was different. The silence was still there, a heavy blanket in the back of the car, but its texture had changed. It was no longer the sharp, weaponized silence of the previous night. This was something softer, more contemplative, filled with the ghosts of the song and the dance. Imani stared out the window, but she wasn't seeing the city lights. She was seeing his face in the dim light of the ballroom, the unguarded look in his eyes when he had asked her to dance. It was a look she hadn't seen in years, a flicker of the man she had fallen in love with. It terrified her more than his anger or his indifference ever could. Ji-hoon didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees, perfectly still, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, a tightly coiled energy that was at odds with his calm exterior. He was fighting some internal battle, and she had a chilling premonition that she was at the center of it. The car pulled up to her building. This time, he didn't wait for her to get out. He opened his door and was on the pavement before the driver had fully stopped, coming around to open her door. It was a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that felt strangely intimate. He walked her to the entrance of her building, the silence stretching between them. Under the soft glow of the entrance light, she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. This charade was costing him something too. She stopped at the door, turning to face him. "The gallery funding," she said, her voice steady, bringing them back to the cold, hard reality of their contract. "When?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's done. The funds were transferred to the gallery's account this afternoon." She blinked, surprised by the speed of it. He had held up his end of the bargain before she had even completed a full day of hers. There was a message in that, a gesture of trust, or simply the efficiency of a man who dealt in absolutes. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate and strange on her tongue. He simply nodded. "I told you I would protect you, Imani. That includes your dream." The way he said it, with such quiet, fierce sincerity, it momentarily stripped away the layers of their painful history. For a second, he wasn't the powerful, guarded man who had broken her heart, but the boy who had once promised her the world by the Han River. He was a paradox she couldn't solve, a wound that refused to scar over. Before she could stop herself, a question slipped out, a soft, vulnerable thing. "Why did you leave, Ji-hoon? The truth, not the lies you told me in that letter." His jaw tightened, the mask was back, the walls shooting up, higher and stronger than before. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," she whispered, a raw plea. He looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant point down the dark street. A long moment passed. When he finally looked back at her, his eyes were filled with a profound, desolate sadness that stole her breath. "Because I would have destroyed you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. "The same way my father destroyed my mother. The same way this world destroys everything good it touches. Leaving you was the only decent thing I've ever done." And with that quiet, devastating confession, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the doorway with the ruin of his words and the impossible, heartbreaking truth. He hadn't left her because he didn't love her. He had left because he did.